everybody to the Sunshine Coast Health Center, and we're going to talk today about some research out of psychology, but I got to give you some background first. Research in psychology that could help you in your recovery. So the background is that back a few decades, there was a lot of psychologists who thought that we could understand human nature by finding what they called these traits. Okay, so these are traits that people have, and that apparently continue on for as long as they live. So some typical ones would be, well, maybe this person had an extroversion trait. So they're outgoing, they're agreeable, and they have all these sub-traits as part of this big trait called extroversion. And maybe they're open to new things, and at any rate, these people became known as trait theorists, and there tend to be some of the older psychologists. But one of the key things that modern psychology realized is these things called traits. They were kind of static. They didn't really change, and they just assumed like people had them. And some of the more modern psychologists said, well, maybe not, because we've noticed that people, for example, may change depending on the situation, depending on the context. And even though there might be some underlying thing, these people will react wildly different surrounded by their family versus surrounded by a challenge, surrounded by some kind of threat, surrounded by friends, and they seem to change quite a bit. And so that we thought maybe that personality wasn't this static thing, right? You couldn't just say, well, this person had this trait, and that explained who they were as a person. That maybe things changed and people changed. So a whole bunch of psychologists did some work, and they came up with this new way of looking at personality. And the basic idea was, how do we understand a person's thinking, their emotions, and their behaviors in terms of their personality? And if you just stick with these traits that don't change over time, you only get part of the picture. Another part of the picture is what's known as this fluid, this changing part. So psychologists came up with very many ideas on this one, but one of the ones I'd like to talk about is the idea that you can actually understand people's thoughts, their emotions, their behaviors by figuring out what kind of goals that they go for in life. And not only what goals they go for, but how they try to achieve these goals. Okay? So we're going to spend some time on this one. And and to start off with, psychologists have looked at goals in many ways, and they've noticed that goals come in sort of two general classifications of goals. So one goal is called a performance goal, and the other goal is called a learning goal. And it's not that, all human beings use both of these kinds of goals. But some people tend to really focus on the performance goals, while other people, we notice, tend to focus on the learning goals. And we can actually tell a great deal of their personality by the kinds of goals they choose. So for example, performance goals. Very famous with the clients here at the Sunshine Coast Health Center is they're right into performance. And performance goals are sort of, we ask ourselves, what is the purpose behind what this person is doing, right? So we want to understand why achieving something, why feeling they're competent at something is so important to these people. And lots of our clients here have these performance goals. And so a performance goal is, well, when I do something, I have to be really competent at it. Okay? So this, in one sense, it sounds really great, but on the other hand, what happens if you want to do something, but you're not going to be very good at it? One of the things we notice, for example, with all our musical instruments in the center is that I've talked to a lot of clients, and I say, well, why don't you just go sit down and play the piano? And they're thinking, no, I don't know how to play. In other words, if they were to play, they'd embarrass themselves, right? Because someone might look at them and say, "You're not competent at playing the piano," right? And then they would get, just reinforce low self-esteem and everything else. So competency becomes very good. And yet, if they can play the piano, very often they have no problem sitting down and playing off some, some famous Mozart piece or Beethoven or whatever they're playing, because they feel good about themselves, because people can hear that and come up and say, "Oh, Harry, my goodness, are you ever good at the piano?" Right? So this is the idea of performance goals. So people will pursue something out of feeling competent at it. But the problem is, of course, this really limits you in life, because if you're not competent at something, you may not go for it. In fact, we know a lot of the people who mainly go for these performance goals. We discover that things, for example, that when they do fail at something, they're not very good at dealing with failure at all. In fact, they really dislike it. So failure is a big problem for them. And we find out things like they will tend to avoid challenging tasks because, of course, the danger is they may not be competent at it and fail. And that's unacceptable. So they'll tend to take the safe route in life. And a bunch of other things we've discovered. But that's one example of what the new psychologists are looking at. At any rate, we'll be back next week with another example.